The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 3. Augustine.
The figure I want to talk about today is Augustine, the Saint Augustine, who lived in the 4th, 5th century. And it's on the theme of the experience of thinking. And we've spoken already, as you know, about Plato and Aristotle, these great figures from the Greek period, and now we're in the medieval period and looking at this whole question of the experience of thinking. And I just want to make a comment, first of all, about what sort of selection do I make? Why maybe I'm choosing things in such a way that I've got something to prove or something like that. And I want to say that it's not a history of ideas so much, or a history of philosophy I'm interested in, but trying to show that there are the whole previous 2,500 years of European history, thinkers have taken different directions in their thinking, and that some are orientated more towards looking at the world around us of nature, others are more focused on what's going on within my mental world, my mind, and so that gives different philosophies because it's arising out of different experiences. Of course, there are other factors that play into this. People are obviously influenced by the culture they grow up in, by the language they speak. They are influenced by past philosophers, past thinking. They're influenced by all sorts of things that come from outside, like Europe was influenced by the thinking coming from Islam or from Buddhism and so on. These are all factors. But I'm trying to plow a course, not paying too much attention to these, rather focusing on, can we see together how this person is having the experience of thinking? Something like that. A nice saying by Blake, which sums it all up: as a man is, so he sees. Of course, I'm also shaping themes. The Platonic theme, the Aristotelian theme in a way, and now the Augustinian theme. But also there's a deeper theme that I'm interested in as well, which I'm trying to carry through these different talks. And that is that there's something going on as well, which is quite hidden, really. And if you only look at one period independently, you wouldn't see it. And that is that as one moves through time, there's something happening in human consciousness. There's some kind of changes going on. The consciousness of the 4th century AD is different from the consciousness of the 3rd century BC. And what is that? What I mean by that is that not just the ideas have changed and the world's changed around them, but also that the way one relates to that world has changed. And consequently, that world looks different. So historical films on Roman Empire or so on are usually terribly useless because they transport into these periods our kind of consciousness and way of looking at things. And that's a falsification. So we've got to bear that in mind. I'm also interested in that. And we'll see how much of that can come out. I distributed a poem last time, I think it was, called Ithaca. I won't say much about it, and some of you won't have had the text because you're new here, and you can probably get the text at the end. But I just want to say something. Ithaca is a poem by a Greek poet of the 20th century, and it takes up the theme of the hero Odysseus in the Trojan War and his journey back to Ithaca, his home island, and all the adventures he goes through. This 20th century Cavafy invites us to look at this myth as a 20th century experience. We are also away to our Ithacas. And so I'd like to talk a lot about it, but I'll just say 2 points today. In the poem, he talks about, as you go out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventures, full of experience, full of discovery. I looked at the Greek. The Greek is gnomatos, gnosis, and that's full of knowing, not discovery. It's not quite the same. So in this journey to Ithaca, the main thing is hope is a long road, full of adventures and full of discovery. And then you'll meet all these figures that come in the Greek story of the Cyclops, you may remember, and the other ones as well, and so on. And these various figures that are obstacles to Odysseus getting back to his homeland. We also have our obstacles. And there's somebody putting these obstacles in our life's pathway. And that in the story of Odysseus is Poseidon, the sea god. And the poem goes on and says, make these your own, take them in, take the obstacles in life inside, make the Cyclops and Poseidon live in you. And I feel that's relevant to what we're talking about. Now I'm going on. Aristotle, looking at, let's say, a tree or a plant, says, I see with my eyes certain colors and shapes and so on. And embodied in that plant is a certain idea. He called it a form, eidos. There's a certain form. And that is integrated with the sensory phenomenon. In other words, I see the plant, but if I continue my observation of the plant, I see the idea. Not with the eyes necessarily, but I see it. I come to this seeing the idea. So that the material world and the form world are united, joined together in one. His predecessor and his great teacher, Plato, had another idea. And that was that the idea of the plant is separable from the particular experience of this plant or that plant. In other words, there exists a world of ideas or archetypes which are eternal, and all that we see in the manifest world are shadows, if I can put it like that, of this real world, and they participate, the reality is there because they participate in the world of the archetypes. So the real world is not the world we see, the world of the archetypes. Aristotle dissented from that view and presented more or less as I've tried to tell you. Now we come to a period 700 years later almost, with Augustine. And we have to see that things have changed. And things have changed dramatically since the time of Aristotle, who died in 323 BC. And now Augustine is born in 354 AD. And in between, what has happened? Well, in Europe, the history of Europe, there's the great story of the Rome and its Roman Empire and so on, and the first Caesars, and also at that time, the event in Palestine, the life, the death of Jesus Christ, and that had a profound effect on the whole subsequent history of Europe. Whatever one's approach to that event is, historically, it's an extraordinary transformation begins to take place. One of the significant figures is Paul of Tarsus, and his story is written in the New Testament. He was living near Troy, the old city of Troy, and had a vision or a dream, and someone from Macedonia, which is part of Europe, near north of Greece, said to him, come over to Europe. So, being Paul, crosses the Hellespont, comes to Europe, and eventually goes to Athens. And there he goes to the Hill of Mars, the Areopagus, where everybody goes to see the Parthenon and so on. And there was the courts were held there. That's where Socrates was tried. And he goes there to preach to these Athenians. And he tells them, on my way here, I saw a statue. You're all very superstitious people. I saw on this statue to the unknown God. I'll tell you who this unknown God is. And so he preaches to them, and he talks about what we call the resurrection, which in the Greek is anastasis nekron, the upstanding of corpses. And of course he's greeted by many of these listeners with a great deal of contempt. They mock him, they run away, but some stay. One of these who stays is a man called Dionysius, who plays a role later in European thinking experience. And now this Christianity is not a system of ideas, it's not a new philosophy, it's a kind of revelation. And that happened. Or did it happen? Or it didn't happen. And so those who take up this revelation, and the revelation is really prior to anything else, it's prior to any beliefs. The essential thing is that those people undertake to accept some revelation. And it's that revelation which meets Augustine in the 4th century. Now, a little about Augustine's life. He is born actually near Carthage. And you remember from the Roman history that the Carthaginians were the great enemies of Rome, and they were finally destroyed by the Roman army in the 2nd century before Christ. And the city had been rebuilt, and this Augustine was brought up in that area, not in Carthage, but in that part of North Africa. So he spoke that language, the old Carthaginian language. His mother was a Christian, his father was a pagan, and he was an ambitious man, a man full of energy and vitality, and he made lots of friends, and he was a social type, and he was 16-year-old, he already had his mistress and was having a great time, and he was at the university or the equivalent learning the art of rhetoric. That means, how do you speak well? And that was a very important thing at those days, because if you wanted to go to the Senate or to be part of any public organization, you had to speak well and know how to convince your audience. So he became a rhetoric teacher, speech teacher, really, in the old days. That was his intention. And then he became, about the age of 20, a bit dissatisfied with his life. He thought he should look around and see what's the meaning of it all. And he encountered some people who were Manichaeans. Now that means they were followers of a leader who lived 100 years before in Persia, called Mani. Mani had taught, given a teaching, which had some elements of Christianity and other elements in it, and eventually he was imprisoned and murdered, but his movement continued, and we have Augustine being part of this movement for about 10 years of his life. And eventually, he became not only dissatisfied with it, but he became an enemy of this movement and began to separate himself from it and look for something else. Until recently, the picture of Manichaeism was very much given to us by people like Augustine, who'd already encountered it, and we didn't really know what this Manichaeism was about, apart from what the enemies of the movement told us. And 20th century revelations have shown that there was actually a great deal more in Manichaeism than Augustine discovered. Now, in the early 30s, he encountered a remarkable teacher in Milan. He crossed over to Italy, and there he became a Christian. His mother, of course, was delighted that her son had finally entered the fold. Quite remarkable about Augustine is that he writes his confessions of his early life. And perhaps this is the first autobiography by a European. No one had thought the idea of telling the story of my life could be important. None of the Greeks thought of this. There was Plutarch writing the lives of all these famous people who started when they were in their 20s. Childhood was not really important. And Augustine starts with his childhood, just when he's even resisting his mother in the cradle, you know, that kind of stuff. Why do I do that? What is this quality that lives in the human soul that is so antipathetic to goodness? Why? Right from the beginning we're like this. What is it? And then when he's about 11-year-old, he with some friends, they nip over a wall and steal some pears from an orchard. You don't want the pears because they're all well fed, so they chuck them away, and then he thinks about this. Why did I do that? This becomes looking back into his life and seeing it out of the new lens that he's discovered in becoming Christian. He looks at his early life in this critical way, not just accepting that has happened, that's what children do, but wondering, what's the source of this? Why does it come about that human beings act like this? And then his whole adventure with the Manichaeans, what was happening with me there? Why was I drawn into that? And this is the substance of his autobiography. He's called prophet of the personality. People see Augustine as the first personality in the sense that we might see it. It's very difficult for us to recognize ourselves in a Cicero or a Pericles from the accounts given. But when we read Augustine, although it's seen in a very special framework, it begins to resonate a bit. He's already talking about the abyss of human consciousness. He sees it as an abyss. There's no abyss in Plato or Aristotle. Now we're dealing with an abyss. What's this abyss? And but a great preoccupation of, you might say, of Augustine is to try and understand this abyss, the abyss of the personality. At the end of the Confessions, there are about 14 chapters, it's 150 pages, it's not a very long thing. He moves into another area, and he wants to understand what is it living in him that's got to do with love. And we've started with love in the Platonic dialogue of the banquet or the symposium, and now Augustine takes up this question, but it's a very specifically directed question. How is it that I love God? What does that mean? Where is it coming from? What am I looking for? And in order to do that, Augustine is not a mystic. He's not having mystical experiences. He's got certain feelings going on in this abyss soul of his, and he wants to understand them. And so he has a reflection on his memory. And I want to take you through this fairly slowly, but I can't read it all to you because it would take too long. He wants us to examine what is this memory. I'll just read you the beginning. If you buy a copy of the Confessions, which you can buy in the bookstores, they usually stop at chapter 9. And it's chapter 10 that's the important one. Not because of any suspicious content that might draw you there, but because it gets theological, too theological. And the early part where he's talking about his conversion and why did he steal these pears and all that, that's a bit more, you can relate to that. But this business about the chapter 10. So I had to go to the library and photograph it, and here it is, so that I've got the text, chapter 8. That's of the 10th volume. I will soar then beyond this power of my nature, ascending by degrees unto him who made me. And I enter the fields and roomy chambers of memory, where are the treasures of countless images, imported into it from all manner of things of the senses. There is treasured up whatsoever likewise we think, either by enlarging or diminishing, or by varying in any way whatever, those things which the sense hath arrived at. Yea, and whatever also hath been entrusted to it and stored up, which oblivion hath not yet engulfed and buried. That's the beginning. And it goes on for a few pages. I'm going to take you through it. So he enters the chambers of memories, and all these countless images appear, imported by the senses. And he says, what I demand appears, and then, immediately or later, images I don't want, he says, I dismiss with the hand of my heart from the face of my remembrance. Images follow each other in order as they are suggested. Images are sent out under general heading. I think of colors. I think of all the range of different colors. Or I think of shapes. Or I think of animals. Or I think of certain plants. Or people I know. Or whatever. Discussions. They're all in order. They're under certain headings. Things themselves don't enter the storeroom. The things themselves. The tree doesn't enter the storeroom. It's the image of the tree. Clearly. Images. Only images. Who knows how they are made? In darkness and silence, I make appear color and sound. In the vast memory chamber, distant things are near. The stars, Rome, Tokyo, New York, they're all near in the image that I have in my memory. I meet myself, remembering what I've done yesterday, 10 years ago. I'm meeting myself again, how I felt. Then I also have in my memory what I will do. I have a picture of it. What I will do after this, I'll drink some coffee. I have a memory. To live in my memory that will tell me what I will do, what I hope to do. Images appear. Who has grasped the depth of this chamber? It belongs to me, yet I do not grasp it all. Where is that part which I don't grasp? Where is it? If it's all in me, where is the bit I don't grasp? The bit which may one day appear, but I don't remember it now. Where is it? Outside of me or in me? Admiration and astonishment seizes me. But not only things like plants and trees and people and so on enter and become images, but also I read literature. And I read. And I remember images. So when I remember images, am I remembering the image of an image or the image itself? When I read something from Blake, how do I remember that? Do I have an image of it? Where is it? Where is that? How does that enter? He puts it in a wonderful way. Not only things, but literature and images are taken from memory. Here we do not retain the images of the original, but the things themselves. For example, I recall a color image, and the image itself appears. What are meant by words and sentences are not perceived by the senses. Justice. I don't perceive that by the senses. I hear the sound, but the content I don't perceive through the senses. What is beauty? What is truth? I remember these questions. What is beauty? What is truth? But in my memories, not images I have laid up by themselves. How did these things enter my memory? For I examine all the gates of my flesh, and find not by which of them they entered. They didn't come in through my ears, or my eyes, or my taste, or my touch. How did they get there into my memory? Next, when I learned things like Pythagoras' theorem, something like that, you learned something. How to make bread, you learned that. What goes into the memory? I perceive them in my own way, and I didn't just believe the teacher. So Pythagoras' theorem, somebody explains it to me, then I perceive that in my way. What am I perceiving? I approve them as true, and I put them in the secret chamber. When we learn, not by the senses, but see within us what they are by themselves, without images, that is meditation. Say that again. When we learn, not by the senses, but see within us what they are by themselves, without images, that is meditation. In my memory, I remember joy. I remember sadness, but I'm not joyful or sad when I remember it. How can that be present for me to remember, since when it is so, I cannot remember? I remember my memories. I remember what I remember. Not wordplay, this is it. I can remember my memories, so that my memory is present in the recollection of my memories. But I can remember my forgetfulness too. So what is present when I remember my forgetfulness? If my forgetfulness was present, I wouldn't remember it. So he doesn't answer this. He puts it out. This is a perplexing world when we go into this world of memory. How am I able to remember my forgetfulness? For what shall I say that it is plain to me that I remember forgetfulness? This wonderful power of memory does not reach to God. That's what he's searching. That's what all this discussion's about. A thing when lost, we can find, because we have it in memory. You can't find the key, you can't remember you've lost. You can only find the key you remember you've lost. So a thing when lost we can find because we have it in memory. A lost notion which we have forgotten, we cannot even search for. Something that's lost, completely forgotten that, so how can I search for it, since I don't have it in memory? When I seek God, I seek a happy life. Where did I acquire that notion so that I can search for it? So different thinking from Aristotle, who sets out his categories and his way of argument and so on very clearly. And the problem with Augustine is that he's not a philosopher in a certain sense, because it's so combined with theology, with his theological beliefs. And so until the 19th century, the history of philosophy was usually the history of Greeks, and then they started with Descartes, and they forgot all about these medieval theologians, as they were called. And now it's quite important to see that the medieval theologians are also thinkers, but they're thinkers in a new dimension. And one of their problems, which Augustine and all the medieval thinkers had, is this relationship that they have. What's the ground of the relationship they can have with the revelation? How do I relate? Can I prove it? Can I prove the Trinity? Can I prove the resurrection of the dead? And so on. That comes from another direction to which Aristotle was not focused towards. Totally different. So how do I answer that? There is the world around me that I can approach with my reason, with my ordinary faculties, but how do I approach this? And this is it the realm of faith? And what does that mean? Is faith simply the absence of rationality? I can't prove it, so I'll call it faith. And I think this would be a great misunderstanding of these thinkers to put it in that way. For Augustine, it's quite clear what he called faith was a force. Just like reason is a force in the soul, faith is also a force. It directs you to something, but it's not something that can be subjected to the rational element. And yet, it's not divorced from it. It's deeply connected with reason. It's not anti-reason, certainly not. And from Augustine's point of view, I hesitate to use the word because it comes to a 20th century. He's a kind of existentialist. He wants to know the ground on which I stand when I say I'm alive, I'm here, I'm Augustine, I'm in the life. What is it all about? And God is as much part of his universe as the plants outside. It's not something he's wondering, does it exist? He's not in that kind of atheistic mode. He's saying that's there and no connection. I have a love for that. That's in me, in my abyssus, the abyss of the personality. That's part of me. I want to understand that. So he's trying to bring all this into some kind of meaningful whole. As Aristotle and as Plato all were, but in very different ways. And the huge change is this event that takes place between the death of Aristotle and the birth of Augustine in Palestine, and which Paul brings to the European continent, and which eventually transforms the European continent in the sense that in the very moment when the Roman Empire as a huge, powerful institution is beginning to crumble, and it's sacked by the Goths in 410, and during Augustine's life, all collapses. And Augustine is there as a bishop. He's now become elevated to the rank of bishop near Carthage, in a place called Hippo, and the world's collapsing around him. Not only is Rome being sacked, but the Vandals. Now, I don't really have to explain to you what Vandals were like, because, they're going about our streets all the time, apparently. But these Vandals were a sort of Germanic tribe who had been pushed by other tribes, who were all pushing each other for territory. And the Huns were pushing some people, and these people were pushing the Vandals, and the Vandals were pushed into France, then into Spain, and then finally they went over to North Africa. And they made a kingdom there, this Germanic tribe. And part of that kingdom was Hippo. And when Augustine lay dying, the Vandals were at the gates, besieging it, ready to destroy everyone inside. So his world is like that. A bit modern, somehow. And so for him, you see, it's a kind of, I want to create something that the human being can stand on. There's nothing out there to be a senator or anything like that. It's not going to give you any guarantee that that's real. Where is reality? So this is The Confessions is the great breakthrough for him. And then he writes, well, he's a voluminous writer. He takes on all the heresies and writes volumes about them. They reckon he's written 5 million words. 5 million, that's quite a few tomes. And one of them, the great ones he spent 13 years on, is called The City of God. The City of God. Well, it goes back to the Republic of Plato in one way, but it's very different. Remember the Republic of Plato? Socrates arguing what is a just society. And they come to the ideas of, well, let's look how a society would look where justice would exist. And so they build this picture of the ideal commonwealth, you might say, connected with what lives in the human being who searches also for individual justice. And Socrates says, in the course of that discussion, that this world you might not imagine is on the earth, but the more we approach it, the better our society will be. And Plato in his life also went to Italy because he had a friend there who was a prince of Syracuse, and the prince said, come and we'll build the ideal republic. And it didn't work because the prince wasn't a philosopher. It's one reason anyway. And so the theme again is taken up in a different way by Augustine in this thick volume called The City of God. The City of God, you know, when at the period after Aristotle, of course, it's a very complex things happening, obviously, and there were different schools of philosophy, quite separate from the Aristotelian or the Platonic. One were the Stoics, and another one the Epicureans, Epicurus, and the Stoa descended from a Greek called Zeno. And the Stoic philosophy spread and the Epicurean actually, widespread in the Roman Empire. And even one of the great Roman emperors was a Stoic. And what does that mean? Marcus Aurelius wrote down his meditations in a little book, which used to be in the 19th century, everywhere in the bookstores, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And now he was a Stoic, and I'll just say one thing about where he comes from. He's talking to the universe. The universe he's addressing. He's a great emperor as well, remember. Rules the whole vast extent of the Roman Empire, and yet he's also a philosopher. I am in harmony with thee, great universe. For me, nothing is early, nothing late. That is in season for thee. All is fruit for me, which thy seasons bear, O nature. From thee, in thee, and unto thee are all things, dear city of God. And for him, the dear city of God was the total universe. And the idea of the Stoic was, will what happens, whatever happens in the universe, treat it as if you'd brought it about yourself. Crunches and everything included, right? Will what happens. And another saying from the Stoics is, the fates lead the willing and drag the unwilling. So if you're willing to go along with what fate brings to you, you're led by fate. If you resist it, fate drags you along. It's up to you to decide whether you're volente or nolente. It's said that, of course, Marcus Aurelius, as the great emperor, had to attend the games, in the Colosseum, watch the battles between the gladiators and so on. And it's told that was his obligation as an emperor, but he would sit there in a special raised place where the emperor sat, and he would have a slave read Plato or Aristotle while the games were going on and the gladiators were being cut to pieces, and he would sit there with his mind focused on what he was hearing from the slave reading philosophy. And that was Marcus Aurelius. Now, the city of God, which comes there, that's the whole universe. But Augustine's city of God is counterposed with the city of the earth. Not that it's a Platonic world of ideas out there, and this is the world of the earth that we're all living on with our senses. It's not that at all. It's God and the angels and dead and the good people and those who, in Augustine's sense, those who what he might call the truth, although it's a rather tricky word at the moment, but just to give you a picture, belong to the city of God. And there are other things that go on in the earth and in the heavens as well, which are not the city of God. So it's clearly a division into not the good and the bad. It's not as simple as that. Plato wanted to bring about the highest good. And so all his philosophy leads to the understanding of the good. But that is a kind of, not abstract, but it lives in the realm of the archetypes. But for the existentialist Augustine, the good or the God is not living just as an archetype. It's a being in which one can have relationship of some order. And so what he describes in this long work, The City of God, is he traces it through Roman history, through the Bible, the Old Testament, through the philosophers. How does this city of God begin to emerge? And at one stage, because he feels the need to ground it somewhere, it's not just a belief that I have hanging in the air. So he then looks and says, look at it. This, for example, the Trinity. I wanted to show you that the Trinity is not some vague notion up there, but I'll ground it for you. And he grounds it in this interesting way, which I'd like to describe. He wants to describe that the Trinity is really something that we actually experience around us. And he takes as an example, any question that you would want to address has three directions. You can address the natural world. You can address the rational world. Now that's different. That's a question of understanding, whereas the natural world would be the effects that certain plants might have, kind of whether we're having, just how I feel well or ill. These are questions addressed to the natural world. But we can also address questions to the rational world. Why? How does this come about? What is beauty and so on? Third question we can address, and that is to the moral world. It's a moral question. Is this good or bad? And these are three distinct directions. And you can't make any other question. There's a Trinity. Now take an artist. Now again, the Trinity emerges in an artist. Because an artist, you must practice your art. You can't be an artist, oh, I'm a painter, but I never paint. I'm a writer, but I never write. You have to practice. So you practice your art. But in order to practice it, you must have skill. And that's quite different from the practice. You have your skills and then you practice. But in order to have skills, or the kind of skills you have, will depend on your, well, it's ingenium. Not genius, but it's your innate qualities that you have. They're born with you. That's not skill. You can have that with poor skill, so you have to develop your skills. But if you have a genius that you, other person doesn't have, that will show through your skill and finally your practice. So again, in the understanding the artist, there's a trinity there. And so in that way, he tries to approach this faith world, penetrating it with rationality, and then realizing there's a borderline there, and then you have to make your own step forward out of this force of faith, not out of a kind of emptiness of rationality. And then again, once you come to understand the reality of the resurrection or the Trinity and so on, then you can again apply your rational mind to understand these things more clearly. So this is the Augustinian way of thinking. It's a very different world when we come to Augustine from the Greeks, clearly. But there are similar problems. You see, there's the problem of love, the problem of the relationship between the visible world and the invisible world. How do we resolve these? But there are new problems as well. I think love, for example, in, you remember Diotima, in the Platonic dialogue, tells Socrates what love is. Love is in the in-between. You remember that? In between ugliness and beauty, in between human and the divine, in between. It's an in-between space. And I explained from this writer, Gerard, that it's a transforming force that takes it from one stage to another. It's not itself immortal, beautiful, the highest and all that, the areas of the gods, not for Socrates. It's some inner force that transforms. And for Aristotle, love is again something quite different. For Aristotle, the love of the perfection. We all love the perfection. That's what all striving is behind, the love of the perfection. In the plant also loves. It loves to perfect itself, to come into blossom and to fruiting and so on. That's love also. So that's the Aristotelian. It's a kind of diversified force in the universe that takes us towards perfection. Augustine, it's not that. It's not quite that. It's this existential need to understand a force in the soul of what he calls love. Now, it's not romantic love. One may be disappointed. There's traces of romantic love among the Roman poets, just traces, but with Augustine, no, it's nothing to do with romantic love. Romantic love actually emerges in the European movement about the 12th or 13th century. It's not there in these early writers, what we experience as love, which is more or less essentially a romantic love. But for Augustine, one has to transpose one's thinking a little bit to grasp the kind of love he's talking about. Is it just a mirage? What does he mean, love of God? But for him, it's a very real, because it's part of this abyss of the human consciousness. For him, it's another impulse, love, living in Augustine. And also, there's another quote, which I'm going to take from the City of God. He says, "This is the religion that contains the universal way of the soul's freedom." What universal way of freeing the soul is there but that which frees all souls? And consequently, without which none is freed. Now that's Augustine. And we haven't got there yet. Aristotle and Plato were very happy to live in a society of slaves. The free people of Athens were maybe the population of East Grinstead. The rest were the workers who made their idle lives, their philosophical lives possible. And it didn't disturb them that a slave should be a slave and his children should be slaves. That wasn't a question. There lives still in a very old concept of society that you find in Egypt, in China, in ancient India, in which you have the Brahmin caste, the priestly caste, the warrior caste, the artisan caste, and the guys with their feet in the mud. That's how society is a kind of projection of qualities in the individual human being. But that's how society is. You don't have to change it. That's just simply mirroring a reality. And Plato and even Aristotle are still living in that. Augustine has changed to a new world. There's no freedom problem. And especially, you can't be free unless everybody's free.
The next episode is about Thomas Aquinas.